wall in front of you. Go through it. Go over it. Go around it. But get to the other side of that wall.
Tear down this wall, this wall, this wall. Tear this wall down. Tear down this wall. This wall.
Well, Pathway, I want to begin this morning by telling you the story of a man that you probably haven't heard of, maybe a few of you have, but he's a man that I promise you has influenced your life in some way. He's influenced the way you have worshiped in churches throughout your life. If you've been involved in local churches, he's influenced some of your thinking on the world, some of the philosophy you have about how this world should be run. And it's a man by the name of John Newton. And I want to tell you his story. We're going to put a picture of him up on the screen. I want to tell you his story so you can understand the power and the glory of God to transform people and turn around their pasts for good. John Newton was born in 1725. He was born to a Christian mother, an evangelical Christian mother, and a non-believing father. At 7 years old, his mother died, and he never really sort of had the opportunity or never really took the step of faith of putting his trust in Christ by that stage of his life. So after his mom died, he was raised the rest of his childhood years by his non-believing father. Now, at 11 years old, John Newton took a big job, and he actually stepped onto the crew at 11 years old. This is crazy to me. It's the age of my son right now. Stepped onto the crew of a slave trading ship. John was in England at the time, and the slave trade was very, very active at this stage in Europe. Now, it's hard for you and I to imagine a world where the slave trade was normalized. It's hard for us to imagine. We're so, in our culture, so repulsed by the concept and the idea of slavery, the idea of racism. But in John Newton's world, it was totally normal and acceptable for a young man to join a slave trading ship because that was a viable source of income in his day. John went on to his first ship, and it would be the first of many, many ships that he would be on throughout the course of his life. And John, as a young man, became known as an absolutely arrogant and insubordinate human being. He was fired from multiple slave trading ships. He could not take orders from authority and from a captain above him. In his teenage years, he drank heavily, he gambled, he was known for just his constant profanity. This was John Newton's life. He was abusive to slaves on the ships that he was on. He was on ships that were going up and down the west coast of Africa, buying and selling slaves, sending them off to the Caribbean, sending them off to ships that were heading into Europe. This is what he did with his life. In 1747, John Newton had an experience that would change him forever. The weeks leading up to the experience, he started reading a book called The Imitations of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. It was a book that began to challenge his thinking and make him believe, maybe there is a God who loves me. Maybe he really did send his son Jesus into this world. Maybe God really does have a plan for my life, and there is something beyond this life and something important for me. He started considering those questions. Well, in 1747, he was on a ship called the Greyhound, and the Greyhound hit the worst storm that John Newton had ever seen. He had been in all kinds of slave trader ships, had never seen a ship go through the kind of storm the Greyhound went through at this time. He would later describe it like this. At one point, he was standing on a section of the ship. He stepped away to help someone. A wave came in and crashed over the ship, swept one of his friends right off the ship. He never saw that friend again. And he realized he could have been standing there 1 second earlier before that wave crashed in. He ran up, he actually took the steering wheel on the ship and began to steer the ship in the storm and the crisis they were having. And for 11 hours, he was at the helm of this ship, trying to lead the ship through the storm. And while he was behind that wheel, trying to guide the ship through the storm, it was there that he gave his life to Christ. In moments of crisis, when everything is going wrong, when it looks like death is imminent, those are moments to really consider eternity, isn't it? And consider what happens if I go down today. And John Newton gave his life over to Christ. And as he would describe it later, when he gave his life to Christ, some things immediately changed, but some things didn't. The things that immediately changed were the profanity and the drinking and the gambling and the constant, arrogance and insubordination. God sort of took all of that from him, and there was a very obvious turnaround in John Newton's life to all the people who were on cruise with him. But the thing that didn't change was he did not leave the slave trade. You see, the slave trade was his source of income. It was the only way it's the only thing he knew, the only life he knew, the only way that he knew to make any kind of income at all. And so what he tried to do was to be a Christian in the slave trade industry. He tried to figure out, how do I fix this? How do I run a ship? Maybe I can captain a ship, but we can have humane conditions for the slaves on my ship instead of the inhumane conditions that all the other ships have. And John Newton ran with that for about 8 years of his life before finally his conscience would not let him rest. He could not reconcile a life with Christ and a life of buying and selling slaves. And so he recognized he had to leave the industry altogether. And so in 1755, he left. He moved back to his home in England, and he actually started working with the Anglican Church in ministry. In 1764, the Anglican Church officially ordained him, and he became a priest in the Anglican Church. He basically became a pastor of his day. He started pastoring a local congregation. His church began to grow and to grow and to grow, had all kinds of momentum to it. And John Newton and a few of the people in his church started writing hymns. And John Newton one day wrote a hymn that would pen the words of what happened, of how God had shown grace to him, because God had forgiven him, God had saved him, even though he had been a slave trader. And he wrote these words down. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The earth shall soon dissolve like snow, the sun forbear to shine. But God who called me here below will be forever mine. Now, if you're familiar with those words, it's because those are the words, those are the lyrics to the most famous hymn of all time, Amazing Grace. It is estimated that today, 250 years after John Newton's life, we sing Amazing Grace 10 million times a year in churches. This is the influence of the song Amazing Grace. But the song of Amazing Grace is not the end of John Newton's story, because John Newton later in his life as an Anglican priest decided to start fighting against the slave trade. He knew the vile, horrible conditions on those slave trips. And so he actually partnered up with a politician who shared a similar passion, a politician named William Wilberforce, who was in the British Parliament. And William Wilberforce was trying to fight for the abolition of the slave trade. He couldn't get any momentum. John Newton was behind him, trying to push him along. And so finally in 1788, John Newton penned a book. And it was a book called Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade, a book that he had felt God called him to write many years earlier. And it detailed what he had experienced. It detailed the horrific abuse of slaves on those ships. The book went viral in John Newton's day, as viral as a book can go in an environment where you don't have the internet. It went viral in his day, went all over England, all over Europe. And the book opened people's eyes to the problems of the slave trading industry. The book gave William Wilberforce the ammunition he needed, the gas he needed in his engine to take on the fight. William took the fight back to the Parliament, and in 1807, 3 days before John Newton died, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of Slavery Act, and they abolished slavery. Isn't that amazing? Now, the reason that I tell you this is because I want you to think through whether or not you would have believed this is possible. If you had dropped onto the Greyhound ship in, say, 1746, a year before the storm came that would cause John Newton to give his life to Jesus, and we had pointed to this young man, he's 20 years old, he's vile, he's drinking, he's gambling, he's totally insubordinate to the captain, he's beating slaves. And if we had said to you, someday this young man you see right here will be an ordained priest in the Anglican Church, would you have believed it? If you looked at him and we said to you, listen, someday this young man right here, someday he's going to write a hymn. And the hymn will be so powerful, it will be a hymn that we sing millions of times a year, 250 years after his life is over. Would you have believed it? If we had pointed to him and we say, you see this young man who is beating and abusing the slaves, you see him, someday he is going to be used to overturn the slave trade in England, would you have believed it? You see, my point is that we look at people's past and we look at our own past and we see the past as disqualifying. And we believe that the past is the definition of who we are for life and who other people are for life, that the past will always be who everybody always is. And because of that, we get stuck behind something that I call the wall of our past. We get jammed up right here in believing that our past disqualifies us and that God can't use us because of the wickedness of what we've done. We look at our sins, we look at the sins of other people, and we believe that God is done with us. And we stay right here. And in this series, Walls, we're trying to tear down the walls that are preventing us from walking with God, preventing us from saying yes to God, preventing us from running forward with God. And so I want to help you to understand that God can use the dirt of your past to clean up this world. You see, you don't think he can. You don't think he can use your dirt to clean up this world. You don't think he can use other people's dirt to clean up this world. But I'm telling you that he can, because he used John Newton's. Who would have thought that a slave trader, the captain of slave trading ships, could be the man who is most powerfully used to overturn the entire industry? We wouldn't have thought that's possible. And we hide behind the wall of our past, and we define other people by their past, and believe that God can't use people like us. And I'm telling you that it's not true. During this Walls series, we've been looking at all the walls that get in our way. We started out with the wall of waiting in week 1 of this series. Last week, we talked about the wall of disqualification, feeling like we're just not qualified. We're unqualified for serving God in some way. We don't know enough, or haven't worshiped God enough, or haven't followed God long enough, so we aren't qualified. We get stuck behind these walls. And what we've been doing is we've been looking at the story of Joshua in the Old Testament, because so much of Joshua's experiences relate to us today. Even though his life played out 3,300 years ago, that's about when we think all the events of the book of Joshua took place. Even though it's way back in history, there are walls that Joshua had to bust through and break through and overcome that are relatable to us today. So to take you back to the beginning of the series, we told you that Moses led the ancient Israelites out of Egypt. He had been used by God to bring 10 plagues on the Egyptians and to part the Red Sea. And then Moses led the Israelites for 40 years as they went through the desert. They kind of wandered and snaked around through some wilderness and some desert for 4 decades. Eventually, the Israelites come up to the east side of the Jordan River, and it's there that Moses dies. And Joshua is assigned by God as the new leader. Joshua, as we told you last week, feels totally unqualified for this. But he's called by God to lead the nation of Israel over the Jordan to go into the promised land and to push back the nations in the promised land. God's plan was to use Israel to punish those nations for the hundreds and hundreds of years of wickedness in their cultures. And so Israel was going to be used for this. Joshua had to lead the charge. He receives the assignment from God. And today we come to chapter 2 of the book of Joshua. And today we're not going to talk much about Joshua. We're going to talk about a character that shows up in Joshua's book, Joshua chapter 2, and it's a woman named Rahab. And Rahab is a woman who had a past that was every bit as dirty as John Newton. Rahab is a woman who should have never been used by God, should have never had a purpose and a plan for her life. She's a woman who God should have done away with and had no intentions with, no plan with whatsoever. And yet, like John Newton, Rahab is a woman who, despite the dirt of her past, God does something absolutely amazing with her life, turns around and redeems her story, and uses the dirt of her past to clean up this world. We're going to relate it to our story today. I think it may provide some of you with somewhat of a breakthrough this morning. So I'm going to read for you the beginnings of Joshua chapter 2. Here's how the story goes. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Don't laugh at me. I didn't make up the name of the town. That's God who did that. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. Now pause right there. I want you to notice that Joshua sends 2 spies to go over the Jordan River and into the Promised Land. Now remember that about 4 decades earlier, Joshua had been on a team of spies. When the Israelites first came out of Egypt, 10 spies got sent in to the land. Joshua was one of the 10 spies as a very young man. When the spies saw the land, only 2 of the spies came back and gave a good report. Joshua was one of them. It's part of why God allowed him to be the only Israelite who came out of Egypt to still make it into the promised land. No other Israelite did. The other one was his friend Caleb. Caleb was also in Egypt with him, but Caleb was not an Israelite. So Joshua and Caleb are the only people who remember Egypt who made it into the promised land because of their good report as spies. 8 of the spies were negative Nancys. They gave a bad report. The Israelites listened to the bad report. So now it comes Joshua's turn, 4 decades later, to try to lead the Israelites in. He sends spies in again. He doesn't send 10. Why? He doesn't want 8 of them to come back with a bad report. So he's saying, I'm sending in my 2 who I know are giving me, he picked the 2 most optimistic, positive, we can win no matter what, I promise you we can win. He sent those 2 guys in. He didn't send the negative people in. And he sent them and he said, go to Jericho. Now the reason he sent them to Jericho is because Jericho was a heavily fortified city. In ancient warfare, thousands of years ago, you didn't have helicopters, you didn't have ways to just kind of easily get into cities. The way you get into a city is you got to bust through the city wall. And so the bigger the city wall is, the higher it is and the thicker it is, the more secure that city is. And Jericho was incredibly heavily fortified. The walls on Jericho were so high and so thick that people were actually living in homes in them. There were homes like carved out in the rock that people lived in Jericho. That's the magnitude of the walls. So Joshua sends in the 2 spies. He says, go to the hardest city that it's going to be for us to take, the one that's going to be most difficult to get into. Tell me how we're going to get in. So the 2 spies go to Jericho. So they went and they entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab, and they stayed there. Did you catch that? They entered the house of a prostitute. Now, I don't know if they knew they were going into the house of a prostitute or not. I'm not really sure. I'm not sure that's a very believable story when you came home. Hey, honey, sorry, we landed in the home of a prostitute when we went to look at Jericho. But they landed in Rahab's home. Rahab is a notorious prostitute in the city. If you were Rahab's neighbor, every single day you would watch men show up at her door, knock on the door, go in. A few hours later, they leave. They're gone. Man after man after man after man after man throughout the day, every single day, coming and going from Rahab's home. Rahab has dirt. Rahab has filth. Rahab has junk in her past. Everything about her should have been totally disqualifying for God to use her in any kind of way. This is Rahab. That's where the spies land. I don't know if they knew it, but that's where they land. Here's how the story goes. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelite spies have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house because they have come to spy out the whole land. So somehow the spies were caught going in. I don't know how it happened. They were seen. Somebody saw them. Somebody ran and reported to the king of Jericho, these are Israelite spies. They're coming to see how Israel can take our city. I mean, they know that right over the Jordan River is this big nation of people. They're aware of that. They know the threat of these people, the Israelites. And so the king sends his men to Rahab's door. And the king's men come in, they knock on the door, they say, bring out the spies to us. And Rahab at this moment does something amazing. Instead of aligning herself with the gods of Jericho and sending the spies out to be tortured and executed in the streets, she aligns her heart with the Lord, the God of Israel. Here's what happens. It says, but the woman who had taken the 2 men and hidden them, she said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it was time to close the city gates, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly. You may catch up with them. But, verse 6, but she had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under stalks of flax that she had laid out on the roof. So, verse 7, the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that lead to the fords of the Jordan. And as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Now, Rahab at this moment, when she does this, when she decides to protect the spies, not allow them to be taken by the king's men, at that moment, the faith of her heart shifts. The faith of her heart is no longer in whatever it was in. I don't know if she believed in the gods of Jericho, or maybe she was an atheist. I don't know where she came from spiritually, but she took whatever her faith was in and she transferred that faith to the living God, the God who would someday send us Jesus into this world. She put her faith in God the Father, the Lord. And when she did that, God saw the changing of her heart. God saw the new faith of her heart. And her faith saved her, but it didn't just save her, it caused her to be highly, highly commended by God. Here's what happens. She goes on, she says to the spies, but before the spies lay down for the night, she went up to the roof, and she said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have now heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, who you completely destroyed. So the Israelites had already won several battles east of the Jordan River before they were ready to cross over to go west. The word of that, the word of the Red Sea splitting, the word of the Exodus from Egypt, the word of the fall of those kings had all made it to Jericho. She knew all about it. And she said, look, our people are melting in fear. She says, when we heard it, our hearts melted in fear and everyone's courage failed because of you. For, listen to this, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Do you hear the transfer of faith of her heart? The shifting of faith from the gods of Jericho to the Lord. She says, I know who your God is, and I'm aligning myself with him. And so she says to the spies, would you please, please, please spare my family when you come to the city to take it. She says these words, verse 12. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and my sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. And so the Israelite spies took that and they gave her their word, and they promised that if she had a scarlet cord tied coming out of her window in the city wall, that they would not attack anybody in the home that had the scarlet cord on it. And they spared her and her family. And on August 11th, a few weeks from now, we're going to get to the chapter where the city of Jericho is actually attacked. You need to come back on August 11th. Just listen to me on that. It's the most important message in this series. August 11th, we're going to go into depth on the attack on Jericho and what God did to bring those city walls down. And we're going to tie it into some major walls that we're up against as a church right now. It is the most significant and important message of this series. Please come back and be here on August 11th when we go through that. But I want to tell you the rest of Rahab's story today. Because when Rahab gave those spies that word that the city of Jericho was melting in fear, the spies took that, those optimists, they ran back, they go back across the Jordan River, they give it over to Joshua, they said, Joshua, attack, 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 it's time. God has given us Jericho, they're melting in fear because of us. Rahab's words caused the spies to bring the right report to Joshua so Joshua could make the right decision and move the people across the river to go and start to take the land. But what I want you to get about Rahab's story is how God used the dirt of her life to do something good. You see, if those spies had gone into that city and had landed in the home of any other woman in that city, then when the king's men came to that home, they would have demanded the spies to come out. And if that woman would have lied, they would have gone into that home, found the spies, drug them out in the streets, and then drug that woman and her whole family out in the streets to die with the spies. That's what would have happened. But because Rahab is a prostitute, and it is completely normal, day in and day out, for men to come, men to go, men to come, men to go, men to come, men to go, men constantly leaving her place, then when she told the story to the king's men, they believed it. Which means, catch this, God used her dirt, her filth, her vile nature, her junk, everything she had done wrong, God used that to save the spies. Do you understand that God can use your dirt to clean up this world? God's plan and intention was to bring Israel upon Jericho and to punish the city of Jericho for all the sins of that city. We will unpack more of that on August 11th so you can understand the significance of this. But God used her sin, her brokenness, her dirt, her filth. God used that to clean up this world. Now, if you had dropped into history 3,300 years ago and gone to Jericho in the days leading up to Israel attacking, and you had seen Rahab, and you just hung out by her house, and every day you watch men come and go, and come and go, and come and go. And if we had said to you, you see that woman right there? Someday, God is going to use her dirt. She is going to become one of the most famous Old Testament figures. She is going to be known for thousands and thousands and thousands of years for what she's about to do. Would you have believed it? You see, I don't think you'd have believed it any more than you could believe that John Newton could be saved, that John Newton could give his life to Christ and become a priest and pen Amazing Grace and end up overturning the slave trade in England. I don't think you'd have believed it, and neither would I. Because we look at our past and we look at the past of other people and we define ourselves and other people by their past. And we think that is all God is ever going to do. The story of God is done. It's based on the past. And we get stuck behind the wall of the past. But I want you to know that Rahab went down in history. 1,300 years after her life was over, Rahab shows up multiple times in the New Testament. Once is in the genealogy of Jesus. Do you know that? And once is in the book of Hebrews. Around the time when all the gospel letters are being written and Paul's writing his letters, when all that's happening about 2,000 years ago, there's a letter in our New Testament called Hebrews. And in Hebrews chapter 11, there's a very famous chapter, and Rahab shows up in it. And we call that chapter the Hall of Faith. The reason we call it that is because the writer of Hebrews, we don't know who the author was, but the writer of Hebrews sort of wrote down a hall of fame of the most faithful people in history. And he goes through all these people who had done tremendous acts of faith, just keeps writing them down, saying, by faith, this person did this, and by faith, this person did that. And then he gets to Rahab, and I want to show you a little bit of it. So here's, you kind of just listen to me as I kind of build up the energy and try to think of what the writer of Hebrews was trying to do when he was sort of building this crescendo of energy to show us the faithful people of Old Testament history. He starts here, he says, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. And then he moves on to the next character. By faith, Enoch was taken from his home, from this life, so he did not experience death. He moves on to the next one. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his life. Do you hear him he's building up energy as he does this. Then he moves on to bigger characters. By faith, he says, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. He moves on to Sarah, and by faith he says Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children. He goes on to the next one. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed Joseph's sons. He goes on to Moses. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born. He's just going all these faith stories and saying, look at Noah, and look at Moses, and look at Abraham, and look at Sarah, and look at Abel. And he goes through these characters that are the heroes of the Old Testament. And then at the end of all that, he comes and he writes these words. By faith, Rahab, a prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Rahab shows up in the hall of faith, the hall of fame of faithful people. She shows up there 1,300 years later. If we had pointed to her 3,300 years ago and says, could you imagine that someday her name will be listed among Abraham and Moses and Joseph and Jacob and Isaac and Noah and Abel and Enoch? Could you imagine that being possible? You would have said, there's no way. There's no way. You see, Pathway, we define ourselves by our past. We define other people by their past. And I'm telling you that when you meet Christ, Jesus is looking at your past and he's saying, you don't think I can turn that around and use that for good? You go ahead and watch me. I'm telling you that through the power of Christ, God can take the dirt of our past and use it to clean up this world. That's what God does. You look at your past, and your past has been riddled with addiction. You say, Pastor, I've dealt with addiction my entire adult life. You're telling me that that can be used. That is the greatest junk and the dirt of my past. Now, I'm telling you that if you meet Christ and you submit your life to Christ, you watch what God does with that addiction. You watch not just how he breaks it, but how he turns it around and he uses it to minister to people who are in addiction. You look at your past, you say, I've been through a whole bunch of divorces. You think God could use me? And I'm telling you, you look at the dirt of your past that you think is totally disqualifying, and God looks at it and says, I'm going to use it. Submit your life to Christ and watch what God can do when he uses the brokenness of your own marriages to minister to people who are about to walk through one themselves or have walked through a broken marriage themselves. You look at your past and you say, listen, I have spent my whole life being a philanderer. I've jumped from bed to bed, person to person. I have not been faithful with my sexuality. And I'm telling you, you submit your life to Christ and you watch what Jesus does. And you watch how God takes all that junk back there and takes it forward in your life and he uses it to minister to people who are doing the same thing and who need Christ. You look at your past and you say, I've been unethical in my business practices. I've mistreated people. I haven't done right. I have swindled. I've lied. I've cheated. And I'm telling you, you submit your life to Christ, you watch God take all of that forward and you start to minister to the business community. God is in the business of taking the dirt of our past and turning it around and using it to clean up this world. And he will do that in your life. So you got to stop standing behind the wall of your past. And you got to stop putting other people behind the wall as well. You've got to understand that God is in the redeeming business. Some of you need to hear that today, don't you? Let's pray. Lord God, we are so thankful and grateful that our past does not define us. Because of Christ, we are a new creation. And not only are we a new creation and forgiven, but God, we can be used to minister to others, to bring change to this world. God, would you use us in the way you used Rahab? Would you use us in the way you used John Newton? Would you turn our stories around for good? But everything starts with Christ. Everything begins, Lord, with knowing Jesus and submitting our lives to him. And so guys, I'm going to speak to all of you. Keep your heads bowed and your eyes closed. I'm going to speak to anybody in this room who has not submitted to Jesus. This morning I'm going to pray two prayers. One is a prayer for salvation and one is a prayer for submission. Let me start with the prayer of submission. If you recognize that you're a Christian, you know Jesus, but you have not submitted your life to him, would you pray with me right now? Jesus, I'm giving it over to you. I know you personally. I've been saved, but I have not submitted my life. I'm still living in the dirt. Help me to submit everything to you. Would you take the dirt, take the junk, take the filth, and someday use it in my future to influence the hearts of other people? I want to speak to those of you in this room right now who maybe don't have a personal relationship with Christ. If you're sitting here today and you can't honestly say, I know that I'm in a relationship with Jesus and I will be saved and I'll enter the kingdom of heaven when I die, then I want to invite you to pray with me to receive Christ into your life. Would you pray this prayer with me? Jesus, today I put my faith and my trust in you. I transfer my faith from the place it's been to you, just like Rahab did. I ask you to forgive me of my sins. I thank you for dying on a cross for me and rising from the dead for me. And I want to give my life over to you. So if you're praying that second prayer, nobody's looking around, but would you slip your hand in the air so I could know? I love seeing people's hands go up. Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else? Thank you. Awesome. Amen. Pathway, let's rise to our feet. We're going to sing that song that John Newton penned 250 years ago.